Hi everyone, in this video we'll be talking about how art shaped the relationship between Japan and Europe at the end of the 19th century. After Japan was forced to burn itself up to the West in 1853, even though some Japanese art was still imported before, the increase of the exchanges turned Europe's vision of art literally upside down. This new passion for Japan was soon called Japanism. But even before the late 19th century, European and Japanese art had met. When Portuguese merchants first arrived in Kyushu in 1543, not only did they bring back Japanese goods to Europe, but they also came with missionaries who could be artists or even scientists. And before Tokugawa Ieyasu expelled all Europeans from its territory, there were many influences which led to a new form of art called Nanban Art, literally meaning the barbarians of the South art. Japanese artists introduced European objects and characters in their compositions, such as here. So, in this foldable screen, you can see typically Japanese objects and typically Japanese shapes, but also a European ship with European merchants. And you also have religious artwork using this time Japanese technique. So you have this Japanese lacquerware ordered by the Society of Jesus during the 16th century. Yet the influence was merely of composition, using topics that were exotics. It all changes when Japanese art finally irrigates Europe after 1853. To understand how deeply Japanese art influenced Europe, we cannot just say that it was a matter of exotism. At that time, art in Europe is a very coded institution with ancient masters, rules, and schools. You have Poussin, for instance, here, you have Titian or even El Caravaggio that are exposed in museums and copied by young artists eager to become a renowned painter. So here's a painting from El Caravaggio, for instance. So in 1871, how do we come up with such a poster? So this poster shows an exhibition of Japanese masters, which is very new and very unexpected, as I said. So to better understand, look at this painting of Thomas Couture entitled The Romance of the Decadence. It was painted in 1847, a few years before Japan opened itself up, and is a masterpiece of academic art. It's all about symmetry, harmony, and a full view of the scene. Now, look at this print from Hiroshige entitled Plum Garden in Kameido and realize 10 years later. The view is occluded by a plum tree, so we cannot see everything, but even the tree is cut, only showing branches and flowers. There is no tree like one another, no symmetry, and you have false lines going diagonal and anywhere but the center of the print. So two very different aesthetics that should have never met. Japanese art influenced Europe in two ways. First one is superficial and the second one is more structural, and we'll see those two. Fashion, first, was deeply influenced by the Japanese aesthetic, with kimonos and even new hairstyles. Claude Monet, for instance, painted his wife in a blazing red kimono, as you can see here, holding a Japanese fan with fans hanging on the background. The scene is indeed exotic, but not Japanese as such, with a very common way of portraying someone. At the beginning of the 20th century, famous American artist Charles Anna Gibson painted The Wicked Sex. So excuse me for the title, Other Times, Other Customs. But what's important here is the hairstyle, all plumped up on the top. And it's just the way the Japanese woman would dress their hair at the time. So according to the Nihongami, the art of dressing one's hair. As you may know, such a hairstyle involved hairpins, and oh surprise, the design of these hairpins radically changed, such as show this lilac hairpin from 1902, which is directly inspired from the shape of the hydrangeas painted by Hokusai and other Japanese artists a few decades ago, as you can see here also. Yet all this is not changing the way Europeans paint or craft artworks. Painting Japanese landscapes or flowers does not make a painting less European. But what's fantastic is that this Japanese aesthetic, as we saw earlier on, which is antithetic of the European way deeply changed the way artists represented life, and we'll see that with the example of Monet. First, Japanese have a strong taste for close-ups and a strong sense of compositions. So here is Hiroshige and his 100 Years of Edo. In this one, we don't even see Edo, you just see a bridge, and the bridge is also partly hidden by a tree and by a wooden stake. What does Monet? He does exactly the same thing and paints his own Japanese bridge in his Water Lily Pond in 1899. But he goes even further. Incompleteness is also key to Japanese painting. So with Hiroshige again in his series of the famous places of the East, you can see a bridge but not a bridge, you just see the pillars of the bridge. What does Monet? Exactly the same thing in 1874 with his bridge at Argenteuil. The bridge here is not centered and the pillars clearly structures the painting. He even adopts the art of the series. So you had the 100 Views of Edo for Hiroshige or those of Mount Fuji for Hokusai. He himself realized many series, his haystacks, his Charing Cross Bridge or even the Cathedral of Rouen, which is here, and you'll see a few of the paintings he realized. There are 30 at all for this series. When it comes to painting trees and nature, once again the omniscient view gives way to close-ups and cropped compositions. Hiroshige's series of the 60 states see you have a trunk on the foreground and many trees on the background, and the first ones are cropped. And it's a very different way of depicting a forest. And this inspires Gustav Klimt in his Beechwood. Before, you would have never seen a forest painted like that. It would have been considered a mistake. But now, Japanese influence opened new perspectives. Colors also change with the use of flat tints, mimicking the wood engravings of the Japanese. Carl Tillman, for instance, realized many colored woodcuts, but also paintings mimicking the techniques such as this one, where we can see that it is almost as if he had applied different flat tints. Also, this huge sky and this sense of the perspective, typically Japanese. The trees have all their own movements, and he even signs with a monogram. The influence also affects the decorative arts, such as the tableware. So look at this Napoleon III set. It's all about symmetry on the edges and centrism with the flowers. And now, just a few years later, look at this Lambert Rousseau set. It is inspired from a manga, and there is no symmetry anymore, and a lot of empty spaces. In Japan, void is a form of art itself. The changes are so deep that even the back of the plate has been changed. Typically wide, but here, while the head of the fish is cut, the body is pictured behind the plate. Japanism deeply influenced European art, and for some time afterwards, as we'll see with the story of this man, Siegfried Bing, who left Paris during the Prussian siege to go to Brussels and then to Japan, where he exported thousands of Japanese goods and artworks, so much so that he creates a shop in Paris in 1874 called the Japanese Art. But he soon expands, and at the end of the 1890s, his shop is now called L'Art Nouveau. If Japanese art is not the only influence which led to the Art Nouveau movement, there is a link between the two, especially with this attention to the shape of plants, nature, and details. Nowadays, meetings of minds still exist, and perhaps the other way around when we think of the work of Hayao Miyazaki. While the sunshade was once the symbol of Japanism on European paintings, the way he depicts Naoko Sakumi in The Wind Rises is more than a nod to the work of Monet and his Flamme à l'ombrelle. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Unfortunately, I had to be short on the subject, but if you'd like to know more about this movement, click down the links below, and I hope you'll find what you're looking for. Bye, see you!